Question for Dr. Ellis. Is the concept of mental illness value-free? If not, what are the values implicit in psychiatric classification and treatment?
It is doubtful whether any concept is value-free, because humans are evaluating or valuing animals. They have goals, purposes, and ideals. And every time you give a label to anything, you tend to bring your prejudices to the label. And prejudices, of course, are values. So I think that the concept is very latent, and the concept of the myth of mental illness is exceptionally tied up with values, as you can see the biased reactions of lots of people in this audience who insist that there cannot be that for their own reasons. So we always put evaluations and values onto things, and the question still is, in terms of results, which does better and which does worse harm? Calling a thing a mental illness, an ailment, a disability, and a disease, incidentally, is a bad name for it, though it could possibly turn out to be that, or calling it merely a social problem or a deviance, which is another kind of valuing.
Dr. Szasz, your comments?
Well, the answer is, of course, it's highly value-laden, and the values, it's very hard to summarize its values, but I can try in just a few words. Its values are quite clearly the debasement, the dehumanization of the people who are judged to be mentally ill by those who are doing the judging. It's positivistic, it's scientistic, it's dehumanizing by its very nature. And it's interesting that the question, the language here is very important. The question is beautifully framed from my point of view because it asks about values. But halfway through his answer, Dr. Ellis started to talk about biases. You see, bias is a wonderful word. Other people have biases. You have values.
You want to say anything on the subject?
Well, I can. It so happens that I have been, as some of you know, or I hope maybe many of you know, among other things, I've been very interested in the history of psychiatry, and I think it's worth mentioning that among the wonderful mental illnesses which psychiatrists have discovered over the years, there are two which I describe in one of my papers, published many years ago. In 1851, or thereabouts, a physician in Louisiana described two diseases, quotes, peculiar to Negro race, unquotes. One consisted of drapetomania, a word which is still in Stedman's medical dictionary. Drapetomania is a Greek word for the slaves who are so mentally ill that they run away to freedom. I'm not kidding you. The second one is dysesthesia Ethiopis, the dysesthesia, the unfeelingness of the Ethiopian black, whose mental illness consisted of being lazy and breaking inadvertently the household goods of the master. Inadvertently. And speaking of racism, let's bring in sexism. I am still waiting for the American Psychiatric Association to apologize en masse to women in America for the mental hygiene law, which was in effect as recently as the 1860s in the state of Illinois, which read as follows. Married women may be detained at the asylum in Jacksonville, Illinois, at the request of the husband, without the evidence of mental illness required in other cases. That's a verbatim quote. I think the profession stands condemned over and over again historically in a way that's never been attended to, which is exactly analogous to slavery and Nazism. There is historical record. We don't have to talk about today. There are the blacks and the women 100 years ago, and look what psychiatrists did then. It hasn't changed at all. It's just more disguised. Thank you.
The element of racism, I think, is somewhat related, at least philologically or semantically, to the problem, because although there is a good deal of evidence that ethnic groups or races or whatever you want to call them do exist, they're not a myth, they do exist, and there's a great deal of evidence that a few of the races, such as the black race, is particularly done in or persecuted or treated abominably by other races, such as the white races, The whole issue is a matter of overgeneralization. The prejudice largely stems from the belief that you are somewhat different than I am, which of course is partly true. Black is not the same as white, and there are other characteristics which may be somewhat different. And therefore, I can stand you and the difference, and you are no good for having the difference. So the problem of racism is not the fact that 2 or 3 or 10 races exist. I really don't know how many do exist, but the fact that many of the races, or many of the people, I'd better say, in the races, do overgeneralize about the differences and bigotedly and biasedly condemn other humans for being a member of that other race.
Let me elaborate on that. I don't want to get off on this, but I really think that this kind of question opens up my historical venom towards psychiatry. In the following way, I'm sure most of you have read a book like Hollinger and Redlich, Social Class and Mental Illness. Well, it's well demonstrated that in America and in other countries too, lower class people, which of course includes disproportionately blacks and poor people, are treated qualitatively different in psychiatry. That they are treated disproportionately by commitment, by lobotomy, and by electric shock, whereas upper class people are treated, and well-informed people, by psychotherapy and milder drugs. Now, however bad the class difference is in medicine, there is no evidence that people with lobar pneumonia are given, if they are rich, penicillin, and if they are poor, aspirin, in a systematic way. There is no evidence of anything like this outside of psychiatry. And because psychiatry deals with covert values, I think its entire history is shot through with the persecution of all minority groups, not just blacks and women, homosexuals. After all, homosexuals are a minority. They don't have sex the way everybody else does. They are a kind of minority. They have been persecuted. Masturbators. Read the 19th century, refer to the book. Now there is a class, speaking of mythology, that's disappeared. In the 19th century, psychiatry was obsessed with a class of people, and here I'm sure you would agree, called masturbators. What happened to masturbators? Masturbation has disappeared, but masturbators disappeared. Because psychiatrists somehow now live in a society in which they are told, look, don't pay any attention to that. That's not a legitimate business. That's not your business. So they made it their business to talk about necrophilia and homosexuality and everything else.
Any other questions that you, Dr. Szasz and Dr. Ellis, would like to address of each other in terms of clarifying whatever we might have discussed this evening?
I'll try a question. Let's go back to masturbation. The fact that masturbation was downed and considered a horrible disease and led to mental illness, not to mention pimples, etc., is true. That it certainly did this, and that was very harmful and created, or helped create, I would say, a good deal of harm. But does that prove that masturbation is a myth? Does it prove that masturbation is a myth because the people who used the term and abused it and called others mentally ill for masturbating were very, I'd say, unscientific, nutty, disturbed, etc. But can we justifiably call masturbation a myth because people not misdiagnosed it, the people they diagnosed were probably masturbating, but that they misdiagnosed the intent and put down masturbators and called them, labeled them mentally ill. Now, if mental illness is a myth, isn't masturbation a myth?
Well, I don't know why you want to bother me on this point, because you are putting words in my mouth which I didn't say, which apparently most of the audience realizes I didn't say. Masturbation is not a myth and was not a myth. But you are not using language properly, Dr. Ellis. So psychiatrists did not diagnose masturbation, and you know it. They diagnosed a disease called masturbatory insanity. And that was a myth and is a myth. It's a difference between the phenomenon and the psychiatric mythological label.
Okay, thank you. Question to either participant, and we'll start with Dr. Ellis. Dr. Ellis, and I really couldn't even anticipate your answer here. What do you consider to be the most effective form of psychotherapy?
with a high degree of probability but no certainty, naturally rational emotive therapy. Otherwise, I would practice other forms of therapy if I thought that they were more effective than RET.
Okay. Dr. Szasz, you want to comment?
Yes, I consider, as I already said, the A, there is no such thing as psychotherapy, and B, that form of psychotherapy is most effective, which happens to meet the existential human needs of that particular client.
Thank you. Dr. Ellis, do you believe that involuntary Dr. Arthur Janoff?
Primal scream therapy means the asinine follow-up to the Freudian hypothesis that your mother and experiences during your childhood made you ill when it didn't. You listened to your nutty mother and made yourself disturbed and are carrying it on. And if you wail and cry and scream and indulge yourself in that, you get this primal pain which he invented and which he hypnotically suggests to his stupid clients. You get rid of that and you get better. Everybody I've ever seen who has gone through primal therapy, and it took, and a lot of people fortunately escape, is much crazier and more self-indulgent and a bigger screwball than he or she ever was before. Alas.
I take it Dr. Ellis is not fairly disposed. Dr. Szasz, your comments on primal scream therapy as developed by Dr. Janoff?
Well, up until the last 3 or 4 sentences of what Dr. Ellis said, I was in agreement. I would not agree with overstatements at the end. I think it's, as I said before, chacun a son goût. It's a piece of nonsense. But if those who believe it like it, it is like any other religion. If you don't believe it, it's nonsense. If you believe it, it works. I don't think it is simply our business to judge it. Insofar as it's done between consenting adults, I look upon it like sex. Doesn't make it... Okay. It is, I think, I like to re-emphasize this, I think that what is wrong, there is something fundamentally wrong about authorities, especially in mental health, psychology, psychiatry, not declining the job of judging it. We should say it's not our business to judge it. More power to them. Let them scream.
Question for Dr. Szasz. Dr. Szasz.
Ideology.
Thank you. Question for Dr. Szasz. Dr. Szasz, do you see a valid use for chemotherapy in the treatment of psychiatric disorders?
Chemotherapy is a fancy term for drinking martinis under medical auspices. Except the martinis are much more poisonous, much less effective, and much more expensive, and Blue Cross pays for it. It's a racket of infinite proportions now. It validates the patient as a patient and the psychiatrist as a doctor. They are both crooks in this situation.
I think Dr. Szasz is against it.
No.
This is my misinterpretation.
I'm not against it. It is exactly like any other psychotherapy. It is psychotherapy under the guise of drugs.
Dr. Ellis, your comments on that question?
Chemotherapy is often used as magic, which it isn't, and often as curative, which it practically never is. It doesn't cure a severe emotional disturbance. And often is palliative and is sometimes harmful, like alcohol. It makes the person feel better, but doesn't not to get better, which he'd better work his or her ass off to do, accept responsibility work. But in some cases where people are actively hallucinating, about to kill themselves, etc., it does get them back into greater reality and makes them amenable sometimes to psychotherapy, and therefore it had better be used in those instances.
Is it primarily a matter of degree, or there are different types of illness?
Nobody knows in exact detail, but it is a matter of different types of illness. That manic depressive psychosis is not exactly the same as schizophrenia or the same as severe depressive reactions, or there are different types, and also within each type there are degrees. If we just take schizophrenics, who are probably the most numerous type, then some schizophrenic have 1 or 2 vectors off, and I think they really are basically cognitive emotional vectors, mostly cognitive, and some schizophrenics have 20 off, and the ones who have 20 off are much more seriously disturbed and much less curable or treatable than those who have 1. So there are all different kinds and degrees of disturbance in the psychoses.
Thank you. Dr. Szasz?
Well, I have all kinds of jokes on this in my books, Heresies and the Second Sin, and the one that occurs to me is, yes, indeed, there are 2 kinds of mental illnesses. If your behavior upsets you, and you are upset, and you go to a psychiatrist voluntarily, then you are disturbed and neurotic. If you upset other people, then you are disturbing. If you refuse to go to a psychiatrist, then you suffer from the most serious mental illnesses possible, schizophrenia, paranoia, and so on. So if you upset yourself, then you are a little bit ill. If you upset others, you are very ill. In any case, you are always ill. Because nobody is mentally healthy in the mental health ideology.
Thank you. Psychiatric hospitalization through a 2-physician certificate should be abolished. Why or why not? Basically, what are your feelings, Dr. Ellis, about involuntary hospitalization?
There better be, in some unusual cases, involuntary hospitalization as a lesser evil. It's evil, but a lesser evil. And that psychiatrists, psychologists, professionals better participate, but not necessarily be the entire factor, which they usually aren't, and there better be clear-cut restrictions on their role in judging mental illness, but I think it's nutty to have them have 0 role in it.
Okay. Dr. Szasz, your views on that question?
Well, you know my views on that question, so let me say something dramatic. I think involuntary mental hospitalization is a crime against humanity, and the physicians are arch criminals on par with white people who enslaved blacks, with Nazis who killed Jews, and so on and so forth. It is simply a crime, in this case, committed by doctors and lawyers against so-called mental patients. Nothing less than that.
This is a fact. How can the American Psychiatric Association decide that homosexuality is not any longer an illness? Can the AMA decide that appendicitis is no longer an illness?
No, even if we agreed that mental illness is a fact, lots of things are not mental illness or are re-decided. For example, one of the main things that was called a neurosis years ago was dyslexia. If a child couldn't read or do arithmetic, we said that child was balking, was neurotic, and was escaping. Now we know pretty well, not completely, but pretty well, that dyslexia is a neurological ailment. So you change your opinion on it. There's no reason why the American Psychiatric Association couldn't call one form of disturbance or aberration or unusualness or deviance, whatever you want to call it, a neurosis or a disturbance 1 year, might not change its mind when other facts or political opinions come up, because there was a great deal of politics in that particular decision.
Dr. Szasz, your comments on that question?
I could tie in with what Dr. Ellis just said. We are pretty much in agreement on this, except that there were no new facts. There are no new facts about homosexuality. Nothing is now known about homosexuality that wasn't known 1,000 years ago. So it wasn't the basis of new facts that this was made. And what I rather like that question, because from a purely practical, sociologic point of view, what that question brings out, perhaps one should add to it, I don't know how many people in the audience realize that it wasn't just that the APA changed its mind about it. It's how it changed its mind. It was done by voting. Now, voting defines something as a political act. If the American Medical Association would vote on whether cancer of the breast is a disease, that would be highly peculiar. Now, they may decide it on the basis of some evidence, but to vote on it, it makes it ipso facto political. So really, I don't see what more evidence is needed that the APA is a political lobby, like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party.
Okay.
They vote.
Question for Dr. Szasz, which may have been covered, but let's see if he has anything specific to say pertaining to it.
But let me go further. Let me go further, because you said something else on which we are in complete disagreement, and let's make that clear. You said, you called the psychiatrist irrational, misguided, some other things. I don't know why you don't want to call them by the nice, plain English word, bastards, evil, money-grabbing, that was not an irrational term. It made money and power, gave them money and power. It had obvious strategic value. It had the same value as calling blacks chapped or calling Jews vermin. And that's to me obvious. It was not an indifferent mistake.
And the answer is you're doing to the poor, incompetent psychiatrists exactly what you accuse them of doing to them.
No, because it's a difference between attacking somebody who has committed a crime versus attacking somebody who has not.
Let me finish. When you label any individual a bastard instead of talking about his or her bastardly act, that is exactly a label. It's pejorative, it's nasty, it's an overgeneralization, and that probably is the source of most human ills, that we label ourselves as bastards, lice, vermin, and we label others as so instead of labeling our acts as antisocial or self-defeating or whatever they are against our values.
There is a point to that, but that's pettifogging. People who systematically engage in depriving other people of their rights, and people with masturbatory insanity were locked up and tortured by psychiatric methods. People who do that to other people systematically are, in my view, evil. It isn't just that they do evil things. They therefore, a person is, in this respect, I am a disciple of Sartre. How do we know that what a person is? In the last analysis, people are something. You know what they are? The sum total of their behavior. That's what they are. And if they
tomorrow.
Please, no comments from the audience. Let's have as much dialogue between Dr. Szasz and Dr. Ellis here as possible, given the time.
And now I will heist you on your own petard, though you won't accept the fact that you are hooked. Because if they are bastards for doing dastardly acts, and let's both agree that they often do, humans often do dastardly acts, then anybody who consistently acts in a bizarre, self-defeating, extreme, and antisocial manner is, by your own definition, a psychotic, is mentally ill. Now, go and wiggle out of that one.
I won't try to wiggle out of that.